Isaiah chapter 40, we're picking up in verse 15. We've started the second section of the book. You've got chapters 1 through 39, and that deals with really the Assyrian crisis to a large degree, as we saw as we ended the section there. But in chapter 40, he's made a leap now in his preaching. And he's jumped forward to a new situation, a new scenario that deals really with the Babylonian crisis, though there's a lot of difficulty in just wording it that way, I'm well aware. In Isaiah chapter 40, we're picking up in verse 15. He says, "Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he takes up the isles," or the Gentile nations, "as a very little thing." He's talking about the power of God. This is what God can do. Lebanon, this is one of the Jewish cities. Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor the beasts thereof sufficient for a burnt offering. What he's saying is, even if you were to offer one of your best cities to God, that's insufficient to please God. The sacrifice in and of itself has never been what God's looking for. And so he says in verse 17, all nations before him are as nothing. God doesn't need the Gentile nations to do anything for him. He's got it. And they are counted to him less than nothing and vanity. So then the question comes in 40:18. To whom then will you liken God, or what likeness will you compare unto him? And this is God's way of asking the Jews, what is God to you? When you think of God, when you compare to him, what is it? Nothing. They can't think of something higher than God. That's the point of the text. And so he says in verse 19, the workman melts a graven image. He's talking about the idol maker here. And he says, and the goldsmith spreads it over with gold and casts silver chains. He that is so impoverished that he hath no oblation chooseth a tree that will not rot. He seeks unto him a cunning workman to prepare a graven image that shall not be moved. He's talking about the person who's making idols. And he's saying, he goes and selects this tree. He covers it with gold and silver and that sort of thing, and it doesn't do anything. It's an idol. And so he says in 21, have you not known, have you not heard? Hath it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? And then he says this of himself, God speaking through Isaiah, speaking of God. Is it he that sits upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in? That's some interesting language there. What he's talking about, and a lot of this language that he uses in 40:22, he is very similar to what we read in Genesis chapter 1. And the symbolism, the imagery, seems to suggest that the temple of the Jews, if you're well acquainted with that structure, had three major sections. You had the outer court, which had the bronze altar in the courtyard. You had the holy place, and then you had the most holy place. And if you compare the imagery that's used about the temple or the tabernacle, either structure, and compare it to the literature you read in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, you'll find out that God is actually making a suggestion that he has created the cosmos to be more like a cosmic temple. And there are certain passages that really bring that out for us, a lot of them in the Psalms or even in the prophets. But it seems to me that in 22, he's talking about the actual creation account in Genesis 1. And you've got the same kind of literature where it suggests that the temple stood as a symbol for God's actual dwelling place, which is even transcendent of this world. So he says in 23, that brings the princes to nothing. This is the God of the universe. He's the one who shatters the kings, the princes, brings them to nothing. He makes the judges of the earth as vanity. Yea, they shall not be planted, they shall not be sown. Yea, their stock shall not take root in the earth, and he shall also blow upon them. And they shall wither, and the whirlwind shall take them away as stubble. He's speaking about delivering them from Babylon, you see. And so he's saying the nations aren't going to thwart God's plan of redemption. God has the power to deal with them. And so he says in verse 25, to whom then will you liken me, or shall I be equal? Saith the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high. Behold who hath created those two things, that brings out their host by number. He calls them all by names, by the greatness of his might, for that he is strong in power. Not one fails. This is all speaking about God's glory and God's power. And then in verse 27, why sayest thou, O Jacob, and speakest, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord, and my judgment is passed over from my God. See, Israel, the Jews, they've been making this statement back in the days of the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire. They've been making the claim, well, God is executing justice on our behalf. Well, that's true. But He's also executing justice on their behalf, but they are the ones being judged. See, God's bringing the judgment against their city, their people. But ultimately, it's in that act that He's purging them of sin and bringing them closer to Himself. And then you have this passage in verse 28. Have you not known, have you not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the Creator of the ends of the earth, faints not, He's not weary, there is no searching of His understanding. He gives power to the faint, and to them that have no might He increases strength. Even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But they that wait, and then here's a text that you probably heard or read somewhere. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They'll mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and shall not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint. And the point he's making here in 40:31 is that the person who trusts in God, the believer, the faithful, they're going to be the ones who are delivered in the crisis. They're going to be the ones who are exalted, and they're going to be ultimately putting their trust in God. And that's been seen in Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 several times. Any questions, any comments on chapter 40? Okay, take a look at 41:1. Keep silence before me, O islands. This is God's way of saying it nicely. Shut up, nations. It's His way of saying, I don't need to hear any more from you. Don't criticize me for being Jehovah God. Don't criticize me for my work. Just watch. And this is God's way of demonstrating that He's going to redeem the people. Let the people renew their strength. Let them come near. Let them speak. Let us come near together to judgment. And then we see this in 41:2. Who raised up the righteous man from the east. Okay, we talked about this passage last week. We talked about several of these passages last week, which form the unit in which we're working. Chapters 40 through 48 are all centered around one major text, and that is chapter 44:24 through 45:13. What's the name of the individual that we looked at last week?
Cyrus.
There you go, Cyrus. Cyrus the Great, the Persian. He reigned as king of the Medo-Persian Empire roughly from give or take 559 till about 530. And so that's the era in which Isaiah is ultimately speaking about. The man's name is Cyrus. Well, you've got certain passages in this entire unit that situate themselves around 44:24 through 45:13. This is the first one that we've come to, 41:2 through 5. And so when he speaks about this righteous man from the east, he's speaking of the deliverer, the redeemer. Who's the savior? Cyrus is. Now ultimately, God's the one doing the redeeming. God's the one going to save the people. But He's doing it through a tool, through an instrument. And his name is Cyrus, the king of the Persian Empire. So we take a look then at the text in 41:2. Who raised up the righteous man from the east, called him to his foot, gave the nations before him, made him rule over kings. He gave them as the dust to a sword and as driven stubble to the bow. He pursued them and passed safely, even by the way that he hath not gone with his feet, indicating his speed. He's pictured as flying through the air in the vision. And then in 41:4, who hath wrought and done it, calling the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, the first with the last, I am He. Do you hear that kind of speech anywhere else? Are you familiar with that kind of speech anywhere else where He says, I am the first and the last?
Revelation.
There you go. Yeah, Revelation. That's not coincidence. What God's doing is He's echoing a former text. If you were a Jew, you could think back, remember in our history about 700 years ago when Cyrus the Persian redeemed us from Israel? What do you think God's doing then in the book of Revelation? He's insisting that another redeemer, quite like Cyrus, is going to deliver them from the present affair. In the book of Revelation, He's talking about Rome, incidentally called Babylon. Same term as the oppressor here. So in the book of Revelation, he makes the symbolism connect. The first and the last who redeemed Israel back here is the same first and the last one, everlasting God, who's going to redeem them in the New Testament from the current oppressor. Now, all of that has a very timeless application. If God has redeemed His people here, and here, and here, and here, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for me? God's going to redeem His people over and over again. And that's the point that stands out. Take a look at 41:5. The isles, the Gentile nations, the heathen, they saw this, and they feared. The ends of the earth were afraid. They drew near and came. They helped everyone his neighbor, and everyone said to his brother, "Be of good courage." And so the carpenter, once again, we're working with the idol builder, the person who builds the idols. He said, the carpenter encouraged the goldsmith, and he that smooths with the hammer encouraged him that smote the anvil, saying, "It is ready for the soldering." And he fastened it with nails that it should not be moved. Instead of turning to God in the moment of crisis, where do the Gentiles turn? Idols. That's right. And then we have this passage. Now look, this is what the text says, and so we've got to accept it as it stands. But this is going to play a major part in how we interpret later texts that come after this one in the book of Isaiah. 41:8. Somebody read 41:8 and 9 for us.
But thou, Israel, art my servant Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham my friend. Thou whom I have taken from the ends of the earth, and called thee from the chief men thereof, and said unto him, Thou art my servant, and I have chosen thee, and not cast thee away.
Okay. We have four major texts that are the servant songs. All of these texts talk about the servant, and they are more detailed. They have a lengthy section of text given to the discussion. But this is the first time we now come into contact with this word, the servant, in the section of Isaiah 40 through 66. And in Isaiah 41:8 and 9, who is the servant?
Jacob.
Jacob. What's another name for Jacob? Israel. Okay, this is not the only time in the text that we're going to read it say, Israel is the servant. Somebody get 49:3 for us. Isaiah 49, verse 3.
And said to me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified.
Okay, this is clear enough, isn't it? It says Israel is the servant, Israel is the servant, Israel is the servant, all throughout this latter text. But the interesting thing is that some of these passages really start to remind us of Jesus. So who is it? Is the servant Israel? Is the servant Jesus? Who are we to identify the servant as? At this point in our study, I'm going to save the lengthy discussion for Isaiah 53. We need to consult all of the data before we really do an in-depth study of who the servant is. But at this juncture in our study, it seems clear enough that it says in 41:8 and 9, the servant is Israel. And there's a lot more that's going to build upon that. So we're not even close to ready yet to look at who the servant is in the ultimate scope of things. But nonetheless, this is an important point to keep in mind. In 41:8 and 9, at this point in the study, the servant is Israel. And that's how a reader would have interpreted that. So when we take a look at 41 and the following passages, keep in mind that this servant figure is going to resurface later in our study. In 41:8, Thou Israel, you are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend. Thou whom I have taken from the ends of the earth, and called thee from the chief men thereof, and said unto thee, You are my servant. I have chosen you. God selected the nation of Israel to do what? Several things. Anybody throw anything out about what Israel was selected to do? I can think of at least two tasks. Two major tasks.
Break one cross.
That's the big one. That's the big one. If you don't have the nation of Israel, you don't have the man named Jesus. It's interesting that when you read your Old Testament, you come to those books like Esther, and it looks like the Jews are about to be exterminated, right? Oh, Haman's got this plot, and he gets the go-ahead from the king to wipe out the Jews. And then when it looks like it's going to be too late, just in the last moment, in the nick of time, Esther steps in and saves the nation. Coincidence? Probably not. Probably not. This is always God's plan that the Jews would bring forth the Christ. Is there a second reason God chose the nation of Israel?
By choosing the smallest, he showed that he was in control.
That's the second one I'm thinking. Deuteronomy 7:8 says that it was because they were the smallest people that God grabbed a hold of them and said, I'll demonstrate my power throughout the world. It wouldn't have been that great for God to say, oh, by the way, I grabbed a hold of Egypt and made them great. Well, Egypt was already the boss. That's not impressive. But by grabbing a hold of the small people, God can show his power. So first of all, to bring to Christ. The second one, to show his power. Excellent. Excellent. So in Isaiah chapter 41, when he talks about choosing the servant named Israel, in 41:8 and 9, it's for two major purposes. To bring to Christ, to show his power. And then in verse 10, don't fear. I'm with you, God says. Don't be dismayed. Any Jew would have recognized that terminology. Have we heard that from our Old Testament before? Don't fear. We even sing a song that says that, be not dismayed, whatever betide, God will take care of you. That one. Joshua. Right after Moses had died and he's buried up in Mount Nebo, the new ruler, Joshua, comes to the fore and takes over the nation. And what is it that God says to him? I think it's 3 times in Joshua 1, maybe 6, 9, maybe 15, 16, 17, 18, or 19, one of those passages. 3 times he says, don't be afraid. Be strong and of a good courage. And then he sends him into the land, to take the land for the people of Israel. What do you think a Jew would have thought of then when he hears this kind of terminology? Probably Joshua, right? He's probably thinking, oh, we heard this before. We know this story. That's what he's saying to them. If I let you take the land before and I redeemed you out of the Egyptians' hands, and I brought you into a new land, what is God saying to the people in exile? I'll bring you home. I'll bring you out of captivity again. We can do it again. So he's making that kind of point. 41:10. I'll help you. I'll uphold you with the right hand of my righteousness. And then he says, behold, all they that were raged against thee shall be ashamed and confounded. They shall be as nothing. They that strive with thee shall perish. Thou shalt seek them, and thou shalt not find them. Even them that contended with thee, they that war against thee shall be as nothing. God's saying, I'll bring your enemies down. Don't worry about it. In 41:13, for I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, fear not, I will help thee. Again, verse 14, fear not, thou worm Jacob, you men of Israel. I will help you, saith the Lord, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. Everything about this suggests what? God's going to do it. The people aren't going to redeem themselves. That's never been the way God's done it. If you and I could redeem ourselves from sin, if we could redeem ourselves from iniquity, God's not going to be glorified, is He? It's always been God's plan to show His power by giving man free choice. And when we meet Him on His terms, who ultimately is glorified? God. God. And that's what He's saying to Israel here. God's going to be glorified because He'll be the Redeemer. Look at this in 41:14. I know we just read this. But it says, fear not, thou worm Jacob, you men of Israel. I will help thee, saith the Lord, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. Somebody get Numbers 13:23 for us. Numbers 13:23. All of these Old Testament texts that have come before Isaiah start to recur. They start to resurface. Why? Because God is making the same points to the people now that He's made years ago. So, somebody grab Numbers 23. What did I say? Or 13:23, pardon me. Numbers 13:23.
And they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there cut down a branch with one cluster of grapes. They carried it between 2 of them on a pole. They also brought some of the pomegranates and figs.
I meant 33. Read 33 if you've got there.
There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight.
You ask the people, how were you militarily? Were you the greatest army on the planet at this time? No. Even in their own eyes, how were they? Little. And in the enemy's eyes. They weren't great. Well, Isaiah 41 is playing on that kind of thing. You worm Jacob. You men of Israel, you're not militarily strong. In another exile in the wilderness, God had shown them, I can redeem you. Now He's showing them that same kind of thing again. Any questions, any comments up to verse 14? Okay, take a look then at 15. Instead of this feeble worm that we've just looked at in verse 14, What's God going to make the nation look like? A tractor. Something with sharp teeth, ready for a harvest that's going to come and gnaw at the nations. And so it says in verse 15, I'll make thee a new sharp threshing instrument having teeth. You'll thresh the mountains and beat them small, and you'll make the hills as chaff. Of course, all of this is very poetic. You'll fan them, and the wind will even carry away the Gentile nations that have opposed Israel. And so he says in verse 16, and the whirlwind will scatter them. And here's the result. When God comes to His people, aids them, and makes them mighty again because they've been faithful. It says at the end of verse 16, and you'll rejoice in the Lord, and you'll glory in the Holy One of Israel. That's who's going to be glorified. And then we have this, verse 17. When the poor and the needy seek water, and there is none, and their tongue fails for thirst, I, the Lord, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. Better days are ahead, is what he's saying. I'll open rivers in high places, fountains in the midst of valleys. I'll make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land, the desert, springs of water. I'll plant in the wilderness where you wouldn't expect a tree to sprout up. I'll place the cedar, the shittah tree, the myrtle, the oil tree. I'll set in the desert the fir tree and the pine and the box tree together. Who can imagine the wilderness all of a sudden turning into a forest? By whose power would that happen? Not yours, not mine, but by God's. And all of this, of course, is in the vision. He's showing him a vision where if you asked Isaiah, what's the movie you saw? He'd say, I saw that clip where it talked about the wilderness all of a sudden sprouting up and the trees growing everywhere. That's the picture he's saying. The question of what it means is something entirely else. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Take a look at verse 20. That they may see. All of this is happening in the vision, and God's assuring them it will happen in their future. So that the people will see, verse 20, and consider and understand, and they'll know this. This is the major thing. The Lord hath done this. The Holy One of Israel hath created it. Here's the point. And this is how the prophets continually speak. When they talk about a wilderness, a desolate land, one that's been overrun by the animals and been ravaged by beasts, when they talk about the wilderness, they're talking about captivity. They're talking about exile. If they're going to tell them you're coming out of captivity, you're coming out of exile, how is he going to say it? Transformation of the land. None of this is literal, keep in mind. The land was still land. It's still doing fine. When God promised Moses and the people a land flowing with milk and honey, by no means is that a literal statement. He's making a statement about blessing, about just massive blessing. Well, what are we going to see then in Isaiah when he talks about instead of being in captivity or exile, you're going to be redeemed? What should we see him talking about? Not a wilderness, but a garden again, quite like Eden. And he speaks to us in terms like that as we read in Genesis chapter 3. Somebody get Ezekiel 36:35. Ezekiel 36:35. Listen to what Ezekiel says. Speaking of the same exile, the one in Babylon, he promises they're going to come out of it. And look at what he says in Ezekiel 36:35.
And they shall say, this land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste and desolate and ruined cities have become fenced and are inhabited.
Thank you. So, we're not in Ezekiel's text, so you're going to have to take my word at it or do your own study or whatever. But he's talking about the Babylonian affair. He's speaking once again about the same exile in Babylon as Isaiah is speaking of. And he says the land, your land, that back home, that has been laid desolate by the captors, Nebuchadnezzar, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, those guys, is going to become like the Garden of Eden. Not literally, but he's preaching to them about going home. He's preaching to them about blessing, about being redeemed from the exile. Okay, any questions up through verse 20? Okay, take a look then at verse 21. Whoever's got it, if you'll read 21 through, read through 24, if you don't mind.
Produce your call, saith the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, saith the King of Jacob. Let them bring them forth, and show us what shall happen. Let them show the former things, what they may be, that we may consider them, and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that ye are gods. Yea, do good or do evil, that we may be dismayed, and behold it together. Behold, ye are of nothing, and your work of naught. An abomination is he that chooseth you. 25?
That'll do. Thank you, Luke.
Okay.
Okay, up to this point in the context, this could, get 7, verse 7. Who is he getting on to in verse 7? Take a quick glance at verse 7. I don't need anybody to read it, but if you take a look at verse 7, who is he addressing in verse 7? There you go, the idol makers. So he's still talking against those people in everything that he's saying in these passages following. Those who build idols, they've turned to folly. You can't trust in wood, stone, gold, silver. You've got to trust in Jehovah God is the point he's getting at. When he starts back up in verse 21, he's asking them, the idols and their makers, to produce their reasons. He says, bring forth your reasons, your strong reasons, says the King of Jacob. Argue then for why you exist as gods. Make your argument. Why do you exist as God if you're an idol? Of course, the idols are going to respond. But what about the idol makers? What will they say? And then God challenges them in verse 22 with this. Bring forth and show us what will happen. And let them show the former things what they be, that we may consider them, and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come. 2 arguments here. The first one, he's challenging the idols. He's asking the question, are you gods? If so, you ought to be able to do one of 2 things. The first one, you ought to be able to demonstrate previous works in history. See, God can point back to several events where He has worked something miraculous. What's the big one that we keep hearing about in the book of Isaiah? A past event. Maybe we haven't heard about it too much yet, but the Exodus. He keeps going back to the Exodus. God keeps saying, if you would just think back a few years ago, remember the plagues? Remember how you left Egypt and then the waters were parted and you entered across on dry ground? And don't you remember how when Moses died, I then gave it to Joshua and he led you into the land and he crossed over the Jordan in the same way that Moses had? All of this is very historical and God can prove this. So God says, if you're the idols and you are gods, you ought to be able to demonstrate something in the past that you've done. Or the second thing is this. Prediction. He says, if you are Jehovah God, if you are the Almighty God, you ought to be able, as it says in 22, to show us what shall happen. What's my point here? The very text of Isaiah itself says that there are moments where God is speaking through a prophet, a man back here, but miraculously looks forward into the future, which can only be the case through miraculous means. And it is because of such an event that God can show that He is God. Only a being that transcends humanity would be able to have that kind of knowledge. I don't know what's about to happen as soon as we leave the building tonight. Do you? No. But Isaiah the prophet is saying that if these idols are gods, they should be able to have that kind of knowledge. What's the implication? If Jehovah God is truly the God of the universe, He has that kind of ability. And at times, with Isaiah, we're going to see that kind of thing happening, where he looks forward into the future. Now, Isaiah may not be fully aware of what he's saying. And there are passages in the New Testament that even attest to that. But the fact of the matter is this: even though Isaiah may not have a full or extensive or exhaustive understanding, he has a sufficient understanding. And that is quite possible. Here's a thing that I currently think, I got this off of a professor at Westminster. There's a big difference between a sufficient understanding and an exhaustive understanding. How many of you know what it takes to become a Christian? Quite a few hands go up. How many of us know all that's involved in being a Christian? The hands stay down. What's the point? We have a sufficient understanding of what it takes to become a child of God, but not an exhaustive one. So it is with the prophets. They have a sufficient understanding of what they're saying. When Isaiah says, I'm going to bring forth, there's a child coming, and you're going to name him Emmanuel, I am content with the view that says that Isaiah's sufficient understanding is to think of a child in his own day. But I'm also content to say that there is a more exhaustive understanding that surpasses Isaiah's mind. And that's what God intends ultimately to come forth into Christ. And the way we find that out is through the unity of the Scriptures. When Matthew 1:23 points us that way, we ought to follow. So we won't have an exhaustive understanding, but a sufficient one indeed. In Isaiah 41, in verse 22, he's saying the idols ought to be able to produce an exhaustive understanding of the future. They ought to be able to tell us what is to happen in the future. The very fact that this argument is being made by God demonstrates that He has that kind of power, as we'll see with the very fact that Cyrus has been listed by name. Cyrus is out here, 6th century. And Cyrus is listed by name by Isaiah, who's an 8th century man. He's predicting something at least 150 years into the future. There you have it. So when these scholars and these skeptics try to get us to give up on the Word of God as being the inspired, inerrant, perfect will of God, and they say, well, that he couldn't have made that prediction. It's too miraculous. Well, the very text of Isaiah itself tells us that that kind of thing does happen. And so until we have better evidence, we better stick with what evidence we know to be infallibly correct. And that's what's attested to in the text. Take a look at 23 then. Show the things that are to come hereafter. He's just made that argument. That will then know you're gods. You are gods if you can do that sort of thing. And so he says in 24, behold, you are nothing. Idols, your work is nothing. And he says, and if you trust in them, if you're looking at the idols for deliverance, you can go ahead and throw it in the toilet. He's saying you're done. You can't count on that sort of thing. He says in verse 25, let me tell you what I'm doing and let me tell you what I'll continue to do, God says. I'll raise up one, Cyrus the Great, the Persian, who's coming 200 years in the future. I'll raise him up, and he'll come from the rising of the sun, another way of saying from the east. And he says, and he will call upon my name. It's a weird translation. Anyway, no problem with that. And he shall come upon princes as upon mortar, and as the potter treadeth clay. Who hath declared from the beginning that we may know, and before time that we may say, He is righteous? Yes, there's none that showeth. Yes, there's none that declareth. Yes, there's none that heareth your words. And then verse 27 says, the first shall say to Zion, behold, behold them, and I will give to Jerusalem one that brings good tidings. Ultimately speaking of Cyrus the Great, who would relinquish them from captivity in the year about 539 or 538 BC. He's bringing good tidings, news about their deliverance.
My Bible says north. It does say the rising of the sun, but it also says north. And then it's past tense there, but then switches back to present tense.
Yeah.
Like, is that?
Yeah, I was going to avoid that. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Welcome to this.
Eric, we'll pray for you. If you know much about the formation of the canon, then what you've got is a situation that's really bizarre. The text that we have for Isaiah is based on an 11th century AD manuscript called the Leningrad Codex. And we would do well to think of it as a book. Leningrad Codex. There are several of these. But this is the Masoretic Hebrew text that we have. How do we know it's accurate? A couple of different ways. You've got several thousands of manuscripts, all of them that date back very early on. And then we start to look at this and we say, you've got 6,000 different copies and they all agree. But sometimes they do not. What happens if we grab a manuscript here that says north, and you've got another manuscript that says rising of the sun? What do? Now we're at a really difficult situation. Is there an error in the Bible? And that's what Bart Ehrman says. Of course there's an error in the Bible. In fact, there are about 200,000 of them. What we mean by error is not the same kind of thing. We mean by error, if I can spell it, we mean a variant. So let me try to pitch the situation of what's really going on with the texts. We have a manuscript here which is in the Hebrew, but that's only one of several. You've also got the Latin Vulgate texts. So you've got several of these over here. You've also got the Syriac manuscripts. You've also got the LXX, which is a Greek manuscript. And now let's think about this. All of these are like 3rd, 4th, 5th century manuscripts. But they're copies. All of these are copies from manuscripts that have come before. So sometimes we have the case where the Hebrew says one thing, and a man who's come along quite like you or me has grabbed a hold of this text and has rewritten it but made an error in transcribing it. What do? We search to go back before the error was made. If there are mistakes between these manuscripts, they exist in human error and not in inspiration or divine a divine hand. So here's my point. If we're working with an 11th century thing, let's say our sentence that we get down to in the text says, from the north. How might this have come out of the phrase that says, from the rising of the sun? Well, to use a very modern parallel, this is a copy from, let's say, a 8th century manuscript. And the 8th century said from the, but that Hebrew word got a little bit smudged and looked a little bit different. Now, remember, an 8th century man, quite like you, quite like me, not inspired, not miraculous, copied the text. And so if he smudges it, let's even say he intentionally changes the manuscript. Who's at fault? God or a fallible man? Fallible man. So in the 8th century, you might have had this little smudge and we can't make much out of it. And so somebody says, oh, well, it looks like the 8th century manuscript says from the north. Well, the 8th century is a copy of another earlier text, which is 3rd century. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is get back to the original. Now, the original either said one of two things. It either said from the north or from the rising of the sun. Now, how do we decide? Sometimes it's easier than not, but context sometimes helps with these little mistakes. Or the second one is to get back to the oldest manuscript. What if we have a manuscript that's 1st century, really close to the Old Testament writing, but then there's a really late one, like 15th century copy? We do well to favor the oldest one, the closest one to the original. What happens here is sometimes you start to see these same mistakes that have been caused earlier on in manuscripts that come after. And if that's the case, then we know they're copies of the original mistake. But we know this, that mistake that ever came into the manuscripts was not by God. So here's the point I like to make. The manuscripts have mistakes, errors, variants. The Bible does not. So here's your original copy of Isaiah, hypothetically. This is Isaiah. Then you have 3 different copyists, let's say hypothetically. And one says from the east, one says from the east, and the other says from the north. Who's right? Well, we wouldn't know unless we verify this. But what if they all say from the rising of the sun, from the east? And then they all copy off 3 other times. Everybody. So now you've got 9 copies, you see. And then 1 out of those 9 gets it wrong. Am I making any sense at all? Okay. That's good.
Honestly, she made a good point. Maybe it just meant northeast.
No, probably not. Probably not.
You don't think so?
I would strongly contend for it being the rising of the sun. Later in the text of Isaiah, we're going to see that he's later called again, where there is no variant, to be from the rising of the sun. And so that helps us then clear up the one that's difficult. Okay, we've got hands everywhere. JW, go ahead.
In that verse 25, it first says he's raising one up from the north, and then it says he's will be coming from the rising of the sun.
Okay.
So I would think maybe whoever was raised in the north maybe traveled down where he's coming to the east.
That could be. And the Persians were definitely northeast. They were up to the north and the eastern part of the world. Norman, go ahead.
Perfectly, that's what
I see what you're saying. Okay, I see what you're saying now. Yes. Norman, go ahead.
A bunch of Normans in here besides me. Anyway, it says, this version, New King James, I have raised up one from the north, and he shall come. From the rising of the sun, he shall call my name. It don't say he came from, it's when the sun come up. It's a one at a time. People trying to make everything harder than it is.
Yeah. The difficulty is you've got different translation committees. And you've got an ancient language, and certain people choose to go different ways with translating. If we had anybody here familiar with another language? Okay, Tina, what language are you familiar with other than English?
Similar. It'd be German, Spanish, French, a little bit.
If you tried to translate something out of German, would you guarantee a translation to match up perfectly if you took another person who's familiar with German and translated it? No.
Because it depends on when they learned it.
That's it. There's a lot of differences in languages. So these kinds of, I don't even like using the word mistakes. Maybe differences is a better word. But these kinds of differences ultimately stem back to the original text, which there are no variants. God said one thing, it meant what it said, and then the differences came in by human error. Does that make sense?
The whole thing's bad. It don't affect our salvation.
Right. That's true. That's definitely true. Right. Joe, you had your hand up?
No, I'm good.
Okay. No as in you didn't, or no as you put it down?
I did. You want to see things about it.
Okay.
All right. I had two things on this.
Yes.
Again, talking about whether you use the modern translation, the older, depending on when you learn, what generation, how you understand it.
Yes.
That would be that. And then again, going for the closest original material is where, and we know as well as all of us do, a word can change within a year what it means.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. There's a lot of difficulty in translation.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Is the tense though, going from past to present to future, is that just, I'm just curious, is that called like that variant?
You have what's called in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you have what is called the prophetic perfect. And whenever the prophets speak, in certain writings, they have a text that you would translate, and you can translate it as present, past, or future. And it is an interpretive move. So whoever translates is going to have to largely do the translating based on how they interpret the writing, which makes it extremely difficult.
Hey, Drew, one thing. I see it as a split sentence. It says, I have raised up one from the north, and he shall come. Okay? Let's go on to the next one. It says, from the rising of the sun shall they call upon my name. That just simply says what he's going to do, his attitude towards God. He said, I'll raise him up from the north, and his attitude is, from the rising of the sun, he's going to serve me. He's going to do my will. And he goes on to talk about that in that sense.
Yeah.
The semicolon or colon splits that sentence up. The first one says, I'm going to raise this guy up, and from the rising of the sun, he's going to do my will.
Yeah,
That's the way I view it.
yeah.
I don't see a contradiction.
No, that's not a contradiction, not at all. Good cross-reference if you're still interested. 46:11. Take a look at 46:11 in your own time. That clears up some of it. Like I said, a later text will help us clear up the ones that are difficult. Thanks for your attention. We'll pick up there next.